Hello, so once again this isn't really a news story, this is more testing on Mantle. Now I've now uninstalled Catalyst 14.1 because it kept causing Battlefield to stop working, and it would do that in between rounds when a round was trying to load, or sometimes just randomly in the middle of a round. But before I uninstalled it, I ran several rounds with Mantle running and with mixed results. So I've got some software running that's monitoring my CPU and my GPU. So while I'm playing I can't see these bars on the right or the box on the left. Those are being superimposed by XSplit. But they do monitor how hard my GPU and CPU are working. So CPU showing all 8 cores and what they're up to. And on the right hand side we have the status of my graphics card. Now the text is a bit small, so I'll tell you what it's monitoring. The top trace is the GPU temperature in centigrade, and that's going to stay pretty constant. The next one down is the interesting one, that's the GPU usage. Then under that we have the clock speed, and what you'll notice is as the game progresses that it's now pretty flat, so the card was basically underclocking itself as it was idling around and is now running at the max. Under that we have memory usage, which as you can see was pretty flat, and then as the game loaded it's gone up to being fairly heavily used. And under that the last chart shows the frame time, which should hopefully stay pretty constant. So frame time is a better measure of how your card's working than FPS. FPS tells you how many frames it's drawn in a second, so if your FPS drops from 60 to 30, you don't know if that's because all of the frames are taking twice as long to load, or if one single frame took up half the time, and that was a major stutter. But as you can see from the traces, at the moment the card is working pretty normally. So everything has started to level out and you're getting a nice even trace. And the GPU is not going up in temperature, the cooling's sorted out. So as far as the card is concerned, everything is running fine. And it's the same with the CPU. The CPU is basically just bobbing up and down, but there's no individual cores that are being overworked, the loads are being spread evenly, and everything seems to be great. So this is what happens when Mantle runs fine. Even with all this monitoring software running, I'm getting 120 frames pretty constantly, and it goes down maybe to 110. So that's not a lot of variance at all, and everything is hunky-dory. What I've done is isolated when the card isn't having a happy time, and about 15 seconds into this clip you're going to see one of the major lag spikes, and you'll notice it when I try going up this ladder. And if you look at the trace in the bottom left, you'll see the frames suddenly bang straight off this chart. Now the monitoring is slightly behind, but as you can see there's a dip in the CPU and there's a dip in the GPU usage. But I'll freeze that up so you can have a look at it. So the CPU and GPU usage both have a big drop in, and it's still not all that clear, so I'll zoom in on them. And you can see both drops, they coincide at exactly the same time, and they also come at the same time as the massive spike that we got on the trace from Battlefield itself. So what's happening is, for some reason, the graphics GPU and the CPU are both suddenly not being used, and it's not that they're overworking, it's that they're underworking. And there can only be really 3 causes for this. It's either the game, it's either Mantle, or it's the video drivers. Now this is one thing we can't blame the game for, because the game runs fine without any spikes on Direct 3D, and the game runs fine with Direct 3D on 14.1. So the problem must be Mantle. And in a moment we're going to see another major spike come along. there it is, and the game basically freezes for about a second and we get a huge spike. I've screen captured the traces again, so let's have a look and see what happened this time. So the arrows are again pointing at the time when the spike happened, but as you can see this time there's barely a noticeable dip. In fact, the dips are not as low as some of the times when the graphics performance is fine. And this is what makes me think it's not the graphics drivers. If it was the graphics drivers, then you would see a consistent drop in the actual GPU usage, but we're not seeing that. So there was a third major spike in this round, and we'll have a look at that one. As you can see, the gameplay is all fairly varied. There doesn't seem to be any cause in game in the action for why these spikes are occurring. Sometimes it's while I'm shooting, sometimes it's not. But there you can see the spike just lights up straight up the screen. If you look in the bottom right hand corner, you can see that the frame time is leaping around all over the place for the graphics card. But the trace that Battlefield is reporting is pretty constant. Here's a freeze frame showing the traces, and even without zooming in we can see that the CPU took a major drop. And also the GPU took a major drop. And I'm not really sure what is causing this. I've tracked it down to it being Mantle rather than the video drivers, but I'm not sure if it's how the game communicates with Mantle or how Mantle is communicating with the card. My suspicion is it's the way that Mantle talks to the GPU, because the game runs fine when it's Direct 3D talking to the GPU. Now in most games when you get stutter, this trace would be the other way round. What you would see is a spike up in GPU and CPU usage, and it's that your GPU can't process the information that is being sent fast enough. In this case, nothing is being sent to the GPU for it to process, so it just doesn't do it. And the CPU, which will be handling moving all that information around, also doesn't do anything because there's nothing for it to do. So these tests are fairly unscientific. I just did them for a bit of fun to see what was going on. But I do think it's interesting that when I get these sudden frame drops, the processor and the graphics card are doing less work, not more. And I would have anticipated that I'd see them spiking up and they're struggling to cope with something. But they're doing the opposite. They're dropping down and not working as hard. So that's what makes me think that Mantle just isn't up to scratch at the moment. And that's why I've gone back to running 13.12 on the Catalyst drivers, and I've turned Mantle off and gone back to Direct 3D. Next time there's a Mantle or Catalyst update, I'll try these tests out again and see how Mantle runs this time. For now, my Battlefield footage will be back in 1080p because Fraps will run fine with Direct 3D. I hope this has given you some idea of the issues with Mantle and maybe a hint at what is causing them. Thanks for watching.